CO2 injection. It's clunky, it's expensive, kinda risky, totally optional, super fun, arguably natural, and really misunderstood even by some of the people who use it.
Hey FishTube, Steven here. And this video will either make you want to seriously consider CO2 injection or validate your decision not to. There's something for everyone here. And it really starts with asking yourself, what's your idea of a planted tank? Is it a box of guppy grass as a hideout for all the fry, or a $10,000 fully automated trophy aquascape with maybe a few fish thrown in for decoration? If you're here, I bet you fall somewhere between those two things, like I do, where the fish are still important, but the plants, they're a pretty big part of the hobby for you. Maybe aquatic gardening resonates with you more than just a planted tank, and that's where CO2 injection starts to make some sense and sound kind of fun, maybe. It's polarizing, and the way people talk about CO2 and some of the arguments for and against it, it's all kind of a mess. So today, I just want to have an honest conversation with y'all about CO2 and where it fits in our hobby.
We learned in school that plant growth is driven by these four key components: water, light, carbon dioxide, and nutrients. And they don't just work together, they depend on each other. Light gives the energy to turn CO2 into sugars, which fuel the plant's ability to use nutrients for growth. And water keeps everything moving, drives the chemical reactions, and even helps hold the plant upright. And if you take away any one of those, the whole system breaks down. But most importantly, the system is only as strong as its weakest link. Now, most of a plant is water, no surprise there, but dry it out and what's left is about 45% carbon, 45% oxygen, 6% hydrogen, and then that last 4%, all those nutrients we obsess over when things go wrong. They are absolutely essential and also dependent on each other, but think of the nutrients as tools and the nuts and bolts. They can't build anything without raw materials and energy. Above the waterline, we don't even think about CO2 for plants. Our atmosphere has over 400 parts per million of it, and indoors, sometimes more thanks to humans and our incessant breathing on everything. So houseplants and outdoor gardens get carbon by default. We take it for granted, just like we kind of take water for granted in our aquariums, where we also have tons of options for light, and the same for nutrients with soil, fish poop, ferts, root tabs, and whatever might already be in our tap water. So that's 3 out of 4. And then there's CO2. That's the one thing that doesn't come standard in a fish tank, at least not in abundance. And since nearly half of a plant's dry mass is carbon, that need for CO2 doesn't disappear just because the plant is underwater. So in the air, we've got over 400 parts per million of CO2. In an aquarium, maybe 4 on average. More like 1 to 2 ppm during the day when plants are actively using the CO2, and maybe 5 or 6 ppm can build up overnight if you have a well-stocked seasoned tank, because some of that little bit of CO2 comes from respiration of all the living things in the tank, including all the microbes, and those take some time to colonize. Some of the CO2 comes from the atmosphere as well, but when your aquarium is producing CO2, that's a hallmark of a seasoned tank, but it's still a pretty small amount. And thank goodness for that little bit of CO2. Our planted tanks would not work without it. We talk about balancing light and nutrients for a successful planted tank, but light and nutrients don't really matter if there's no CO2. In any planted tank, everything we do to reduce algae and keep plants healthy and growing, choosing one of the million options for fertilizer, and most importantly, adjusting our lights. What we're really doing is managing our supply of CO2, by far the biggest bottleneck for growth in a planted tank. But despite how important it is, even in a low-tech aquatic garden, CO2 doesn't get talked about as much as it should. So when the topic does come up, people tend to assume we must be talking specifically about CO2 injection.
Okay, yeah, this video is about CO2 injection, but my point is, CO2 levels are low in our aquariums, and in fact, they can be unnaturally low compared to where a lot of our plants come from. And the only way to break through that ceiling is by actually supplementing CO2 like we do with pressurized injection. But if your plants are doing fine, why bother?
We know there are tons of plants in the aquarium trade that'll do great in a seasoned, well-balanced tank with just a few parts per million of CO2. For starters, aquatic plants are inherently more efficient and their leaves don't require as much energy to grow as terrestrial leaves. So out of the several hundred varieties of aquarium plants, we can find some that work for our tanks. Even a select few plants, especially true aquatic weeds like hornwort and most Vallisneria, guppy grass, and acarus, when dissolved CO2 is low, they'll switch to using bicarbonate, that's your KH, and converting that to CO2 internally. It's not their preferred way of getting carbon, but it's effective. And on the opposite end, we have plants like Anubias, Java fern, Boos, and Bulbitis that can handle life underwater as a slow grower. But in nature, they usually have some amount of growth above water and can access that atmospheric CO2. So our strategy for keeping them healthy, submerged in a low-tech tank is starting them in lower light, meaning a lower energy input that literally just keeps the system's demands low. So it's not exactly breaking news that you can have a nice, lush aquarium aquatic garden without CO2 injection, and that right there is one perfectly valid reason you might want to just skip CO2 enrichment entirely. Just find the plants that'll thrive in your water as it is. Most of us have already done exactly that, and all my tanks I've shown you so far have never been CO2 injected.
And if your plants aren't doing so great and you're still trying to figure out why, adding a CO2 system is just adding another variable. It's not a fix-all. Now, granted, it usually helps, but say you're having car trouble. Yeah, you want to make sure there's gas in the tank, but if that only makes the car hobble along, then there also might be a bunch of other problems under the hood, like, I don't really know how cars work. I still drive one though, and plenty of people still keep beautiful aquatic gardens without fully understanding why they're successful. But if you do want to understand and you want to level up and get that control and consistency, that's where this part of the hobby gets real fun. That whole journey to refinement can be addictive, learning your system's limits, and then you either work within them or change them on purpose. And that's where CO2 becomes a fantastic learning tool. But that kind of approach comes with a cost, like money, yeah, and how much money is a whole separate debate on what hardware to buy, but also your time. It's research, testing, observing, adjusting, and maybe a lot more tank maintenance, or maybe not. We'll get to that part later.
You can dabble in CO2 injection and get pretty decent results, or you can really get into it and make it an opportunity to advance in the aquatic gardening hobby, or make you want to abandon that part of the hobby altogether if disaster strikes. Because for many of us, there is an understandable fear of CO2 injection, and the fear is that it ends up killing your fish. Because yeah, done wrong, it absolutely can. Fish diffuse CO2 out through their gills, a byproduct of respiration. But if there's too much CO2 in the water, they can't release it. It builds up in their blood and they struggle more and more to take in oxygen, and basically, they suffocate. And that tipping point is different for every fish, so that's why we take it slow when we first set up a CO2 system, and absolutely use reliable equipment. It also really helps to keep good surface agitation, which can prevent too much CO2 buildup and ensure there's a good supply of oxygen in the water. And I'm not trying to dismiss or even alleviate your fears right now, because yeah, the risk can be mitigated pretty well, but you are still adding another potential point of failure, and that deserves full attention and respect. I have felt the heartache and the guilt for making that mistake. Our fish are not disposable. Their well-being is not secondary to our gardening goals.
Are you ready for the best reason not to inject CO2? You just don't want to. More money, more clutter, something else to maintain. The more wires and tubing connected to the tank, the more that could make someone feel disconnected from what they truly love about the hobby, which is the life in the tank. But sometimes that disconnect can lead to people framing a CO2 system as something bad for everyone. There is a bit of a stigma attached to anything that seems artificial. Like, I've heard CO2 called steroids for plants, or a drug, or even cheating. Like, we're pushing plants beyond what they're meant to do. And I mean, a metal can of pressurized gas that's controlled by a precision regulator that feeds to a reactor, all scheduled on a Wi-Fi timer, it's hard to call that anything but unnatural. However, let's put CO2 enrichment in the proper context, and that context starts with nature.
Is a CO2 system unnatural, or is it really any more unnatural than the lights, heaters, filters, and air pumps that keep all those closed systems in our fish room running? And we may not use all of this equipment for every tank, but most of us at least use a combination of equipment to control our aquariums, because control is the nature of a closed system. And what we're doing to many of our plants in the first place is not exactly what nature intended. Most of the plants in the aquarium trade are not even fully aquatic. They spend a lot of time in nature immersed, growing above the water or even on land, soaking up atmospheric CO2. Their submerged form is more of an adaptation for the rainy season, but even that has some exceptions. There are very specific natural environments that do support permanent submerged growth like we typically keep in our aquatic gardens. You can find these slices of nature all over the world, and it just so happens that the most lush underwater plant growth tends to show up in places where the earth itself is feeding the system. We're talking primarily about ecosystems where groundwater from limestone or volcanic aquifers is saturated with CO2, and that water feeds into rivers and streams. Right at those headwaters, you'll see the greatest density and diversity of plant growth. Natural underwater gardens where the dissolved CO2 concentration can range quite a bit higher than what we can achieve in an aquarium, unless we inject CO2. Now, these stock video clips show some decent examples, but if you've ever seen the stunning underwater plant footage from channels like Below Water and Chris Lukow, you really know what I'm talking about, where you find underwater meadows and jungles like this, nature is injecting CO2. So why can't we replicate these higher CO2 ranges naturally in our tanks? Because even when we're trying to recreate a biotope, taking a slice of nature and jamming it into an aquarium, we are isolating it from the massive geological engine that makes that slice of nature possible. Now we've got LEDs as a makeshift sun and heaters and filters and water changes for stability and cleanliness, and we might have all the biodiversity we can cram in that tank and lay down a nice thick pile of our favorite substrate, but none of that will come close to doing the job of thousands of years of decay, weathering, and runoff from giant chunks of our planet feeding CO2 into natural waterways. But a pressurized cylinder of CO2 can fill in for that just fine, and it actually fits in the fish room. Now, does this define every underwater ecosystem that happens to have plants? Not even close. Freshwater environments are extremely diverse, just like this wonderful hobby.
Yeah, it seems weird to consider a big-ass can of CO2 to be part of an ecosystem, but doesn't it kind of earn its place alongside the other stuff we already use to mimic nature in a fish room? When you think about it, we're already permanently waterboarding these plants most of the time, and in a non-injected setup, in some cases, we're expecting plants to thrive on even fewer resources. Isn't that slightly less natural than just giving them a little more CO2? Okay, that's debatable, but also the whole natural versus unnatural argument does not need to be that serious. We keep our fish happy and healthy, and these are plants. This is for fun. We're having fun. We're having fun. So yeah, CO2 injection because nature, or because it lets you keep a wider variety of plants underwater, and that's fun. And because you like buying a bunch of expensive fancy little cultivars and screaming at them to just act like regular plants, that's fun too. Is it? Am I having fun?
I do enjoy the challenge of some of the more difficult plants, and the maintenance is therapeutic to me, but maybe not so much for you, and maybe you've heard what's probably the biggest misconception about CO2 injection, that it's only for high light, ultra demanding plants in high-tech setups with constant maintenance and obsessing over fertilizer ratios. Yeah, f that. I have 8 CO2 injected tanks, not to mention all my non-injected tanks on top of that, and also I have a life and I still want my family to love me. And the good news is, CO2 injection and low light is a low maintenance winning combination, highly underrated and misunderstood. Adding CO2 does not increase demand for light. Actually, it's the other way around. More light speeds up plant metabolism, which increases their demand for CO2. So yeah, you might think low light means you don't need any extra CO2, that it would just go to waste. But part of the reason CO2 is such a bottleneck in the aquarium is just that CO2 molecules diffuse way more slowly in water than they do in air, like 10,000 times slower. It takes longer to reach the plant. So when you raise the concentration of CO2, you're giving the plants more carbon and making it easier for them to get it. And when the plants don't have to work so hard to grab CO2, they can put that energy toward grabbing other important stuff like photons. Light. They become more efficient at photosynthesis. So CO2 enrichment will give you that signature robust plant growth even with lower to moderate light. I've hoarded a lot of aquarium plants over the years, and among my favorites are still the Crypts, Anubias, and Boos, and I love them even more in a CO2 injected low to medium light tank, where I can still add in a few colorful stem plants like this Alternanthera, one that's typically assumed to need high light, but really it just needs more carbon. If you take your most stable planted tank where everything is already growing just fine and has been for ages, change nothing about your light settings or fertilizer routine, but introduce even a moderate steady level of CO2 enrichment, it will not take long to see a difference. And it's not about solving a problem here, we're just removing a ceiling. The plants will grow stronger, healthier, and just look better. And you don't have to force them into overdrive. You run the tank, it doesn't run you. Because CO2 injection doesn't mean you need to run bright lights. But it does mean you can. If you're the type who loves to tinker around and experiment, you might enjoy adding to that some more trimming and replanting and water changes and maybe learning a bit of automation or being kind of afraid to leave the house. Those kinds of tanks can be fun as hell. You get rapid, super dense growth, maximum color, maximum impact. Every little change you make can send ripples through the whole system. Sometimes it'll make you question your life choices. It's the joy of a high energy setup. It's chaotic, it's gorgeous, and you can learn a lot very quickly. And once you get the hang of it, that speed works in your favor if you want to grow a garden, trim it down, sell or trade the excess, or even set up a plant farm tank for a little side hustle. Plenty of hobbyists pay off their CO2 gear over time just selling trimmings. But here's the thing, even in high light, you're still in control of how often you want to trim. It doesn't have to be a tank full of stem plants. Consider CO2 your currency for plant growth. It's up to you how you spend it. And these clips in my tanks are not meant to be examples of peak refinement. I'm on a journey me just like you. And what you'll see in these aquariums is a reflection of what I've learned, what I like, and the work I'm willing to put into them. That's how I know I'm doing the hobby for me. And that's why in some of my tanks, I inject CO2. It gives me more options, a few more ways to have fun. So after all that, you might have more questions than you came here with, like what kind of equipment? How do I dial in CO2 safely? How do I figure out why my plants aren't thriving? Where do babies come from? Ask away in the comments, but also my friend Dr. Kelly Foreman and I do a live stream called Wet Your Plants. It happens every Monday at 4 p.m. Central, and it's where we answer those exact kinds of questions live. We're there to help you grow better plants, but also it's a fun hangout, and the chat is full of smart people as well. Fair warning for the kids though, we don't censor ourselves. Oh, and yeah, we talk about CO2 like a lot. Hey, did you know there's a community of people just like you here on YouTube? You can hang out with the Fish Fam right here during our live streams every Friday night at 8:30 p.m. Central, where we talk fish, play games, and go off the rails. And catch us live every Monday at 4 p.m. Central to talk about plants. And you can find out more about the community, including other live streams, at fishfam.link. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like and subscribe for more videos to come. Thank you so much, and I'll see you later.